Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that while the world watches the tech war between the United States and China, Canada has quietly positioned itself to control the most critical supply chain of the next 50 years? And what happens when every electric vehicle, every solar panel, and every smartphone depends on materials that flow through Canadian territory? Most people don't realize that the green energy revolution is not just about solar panels and wind turbines. It's about lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth elements. These are the materials that make batteries work, and without them, the entire transition to clean energy stops dead. China currently controls most of the processing for these critical minerals, creating what defense analysts call economic choke points. But Canada sits on some of the largest untapped deposits of these materials in the world. The question is, are we smart enough to avoid the mistakes that made us dependent on others for oil refining? This is the story of how Canada could win the battery wars, and why the next decade will determine whether we become a critical minerals superpower or just another country that ships raw materials to be processed elsewhere. To understand why critical minerals matter, we need to grasp the scale of the transformation happening in the global economy right now. This isn't just about electric cars. It's about the complete electrification of human civilization. The numbers are staggering. Global electric vehicle sales are expected to grow from 10 million units in 2022 to over 100 million units by 2030. Each electric vehicle requires roughly 180 pounds of critical minerals, 6 times more than a traditional internal combustion engine. But transportation is just the beginning. The renewable energy revolution requires massive battery storage systems to handle the intermittent nature of solar and wind power. A single utility-scale battery storage facility can require thousands of tons of lithium, nickel, and cobalt. Data centers powering artificial intelligence and cloud computing are also driving demand for advanced battery systems. As these facilities grow larger and more energy hungry, they need sophisticated backup power systems that rely heavily on critical mineral-intensive batteries. Even our military systems are transitioning to electric power. Modern weapon systems, communication equipment, and surveillance technology all depend on advanced battery technologies that require these same critical minerals. The International Energy Agency projects that demand for lithium will increase by 4,000% by 2040. Nickel demand will triple. Cobalt demand will double. This isn't gradual change. It's an industrial revolution happening at hyperspeed. Here's what makes this particularly significant. Unlike oil, which can be substituted with other energy sources, these critical minerals have few alternatives. You can't make a lithium-ion battery without lithium. You can't make high-performance electric motors without rare earth magnets. The countries that control these supply chains will control the future economy. Before we examine Canada's opportunities, we need to understand how China achieved its current stranglehold on critical mineral processing. This didn't happen by accident. It was a deliberate strategic decision made decades ago. While Western countries focused on financial services and high-tech manufacturing, China systematically invested in the dirty industries that nobody else wanted. Mining, smelting, and chemical processing are environmentally challenging and often unprofitable in the short term. But China played a longer game. Today, China processes 60% of the world's lithium, despite producing only 25% of the raw material. They refine 80% of all cobalt, even though most cobalt is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They control 90% of rare earth element processing, creating a near monopoly on materials essential for wind turbines and electric vehicle motors. This dominance isn't just about market share. It's about geopolitical leverage. In 2010, China restricted rare earth exports to Japan during a diplomatic dispute, causing global electronics prices to spike and forcing Japanese manufacturers to relocate operations to China. More recently, China has threatened to restrict critical mineral exports to countries that limit Chinese investment or impose trade restrictions. This is economic warfare disguised as trade policy. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed just how vulnerable this system is. When Chinese processing facilities shut down, global supply chains for everything from smartphones to medical equipment were disrupted. Western governments finally realized they had allowed a strategic competitor to gain control over materials essential to modern civilization. But here's what should concern every Canadian. China achieved this dominance partly by buying Canadian raw materials at low prices and adding massive value through processing. We made the same mistake with critical minerals that we made with oil. We became hewers of wood and drawers of water instead of builders of finished products. Now let's examine what Canada actually possesses. The Canadian Shield, that massive formation of ancient rock stretching across northern Ontario, Quebec, and into the territories, is one of the richest geological formations on Earth. We have the world's 4th largest lithium reserves, concentrated primarily in Quebec and the Northwest Territories. The James Bay region alone could supply global lithium demand for decades. Our nickel reserves are even more impressive. The Sudbury Basin in Ontario contains some of the highest grade nickel deposits ever discovered. Vale and Glencore operate massive extraction operations there, but most of the ore is shipped elsewhere for processing. Here's a number that should shock every Canadian. We have enough cobalt reserves to supply global demand for over 30 years, yet we process less than 5% of what we mine. The rest is shipped to China and Europe, where it's refined and sold back to us as batteries and electronic components. The rare earth situation is particularly frustrating. Northern Quebec and Saskatchewan contain significant rare earth deposits, but we've allowed Chinese companies to dominate the processing technology. The Nechalaco deposit in the Northwest Territories is one of the largest rare earth mines outside China, yet its output must be processed overseas. But perhaps most importantly, we have something that China and most other countries lack: political stability and environmental standards that international companies can trust for long-term investments. Mining companies are increasingly concerned about operating in politically unstable regions. The Democratic Republic of Congo produces 70% of the world's cobalt, but ongoing conflict and governance problems make it an unreliable source. China's authoritarian system creates regulatory risks for international companies. Canada offers something unique: vast mineral wealth combined with rule of law, environmental protection, and long-term investment security. This combination should make us the preferred source for companies building the clean energy economy. The frustrating reality is that having raw materials isn't enough. The real value, and the real strategic importance, lies in processing these materials into usable forms. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works. Raw lithium ore might sell for $1,000 per ton. Battery-grade lithium carbonate, the processed form used in actual batteries, sells for $15,000 to $25,000 per ton. The processing step adds 25 times more value than the extraction step. This means that countries that only mine and export raw materials capture maybe 5% of the total value chain, while countries that process materials capture 60 or 80% of the value. We've been leaving money on the table for decades. The processing infrastructure is also where the jobs are created. A lithium mine might employ 200 and 500 people. A battery-grade lithium processing facility employs 1,000, 2,000 people in higher-skilled, higher-paying positions. The downstream manufacturing of batteries and electric vehicles can employ tens of thousands more. But building processing capability isn't just about economics. It's about strategic autonomy. Countries that only export raw materials are price takers. Countries that control processing are price makers. They can influence global supply chains and use their processing capacity as diplomatic leverage. China understood this decades ago. They were willing to accept environmental costs and operate processing facilities at a loss for years to build market share and strategic position. Now they can essentially set global prices for processed critical minerals. Canada is at a crossroads. We can continue shipping raw materials to China and importing finished batteries, or we can invest in building a domestic critical minerals processing industry. The choice we make will determine whether we're a supplier or a strategic player in the clean energy economy. The good news is that Canadian governments are finally recognizing the strategic importance of critical minerals. The federal government released its critical mineral strategy in 2022, identifying 31 minerals essential to economic security and green transition. The strategy includes $3.8 billion in funding for critical minerals development over 8 years. This includes support for exploration, processing infrastructure, and research and development into new extraction and processing technologies. Several provinces have also launched their own critical minerals initiatives. Quebec has committed over $400 million to develop its lithium processing capacity. Ontario is investing in battery manufacturing facilities that would create markets for domestically processed materials. But perhaps most importantly, Canada is leveraging international partnerships to build processing capabilities. The Canada-U.S. Joint Action Plan on Critical Minerals creates a North American supply chain that reduces dependence on Chinese processing. Under this agreement, Canadian raw materials can be processed in either country, and both countries commit to sourcing critical minerals from each other rather than from potentially hostile nations. This creates a larger, more secure market for Canadian processors. The Canada-EU Strategic Partnership on Raw Materials represents another approach. European countries need secure sources of critical minerals to support their green transition, and they bring advanced processing technologies that Canadian companies can license or joint venture. The numbers suggest this strategy is working. Since 2020, over $15 billion in private investment has been announced for critical minerals projects in Canada. This includes new mines, processing facilities, and battery manufacturing plants. Let's look at some concrete examples of how Canadian companies are building critical minerals processing capabilities and capturing more value from our resources. Lithium Americas Corporation is developing the Thacker Pass project in Nevada, but more importantly, they're planning to build lithium processing facilities in Quebec. This would make Canada one of the few countries outside China with integrated lithium mining and processing capabilities. Talon Metals, working with Tesla, is developing a nickel processing facility in Minnesota that would process ore from Canadian mines. This creates a North American nickel supply chain that doesn't depend on Chinese or Russian processing. Neo Performance Materials, based in Toronto, has become one of the world's largest processors of rare earth elements outside China. They've built processing facilities in Estonia, Singapore, and other locations, proving that Canadian companies can compete in the high-tech processing market. Perhaps most significantly, several major automakers are announcing battery manufacturing facilities in Canada. General Motors is building a battery plant in Ontario. Ford is considering a similar facility in Quebec. These plants create demand for Canadian processed battery materials. The provincial governments are also playing strategic roles. Quebec Hydro has begun offering preferential electricity rates to critical minerals processing facilities, leveraging our clean energy advantage to attract investment. Ontario is creating specialized industrial zones for battery manufacturing, offering streamlined environmental approvals and tax incentives for companies that commit to sourcing materials from Canadian processors. These initiatives are creating what economists call industrial clustering, when related industries locate near each other to share resources, expertise, and supply chains. Canada is building critical minerals clusters that could become globally competitive. One of Canada's biggest advantages in the critical minerals sector is our commitment to environmental and social standards. This might seem like a disadvantage in competition with countries that ignore environmental costs, but it's actually becoming a major competitive advantage. International companies, especially European automakers, are facing increasing pressure to source materials responsibly. The European Union's new battery regulation requires companies to prove their supply chains meet environmental and human rights standards. Canadian critical minerals operations generally exceed these standards, making our materials preferred inputs for companies selling into environmentally conscious markets. This clean premium can justify higher prices for Canadian materials. Indigenous communities are also becoming key partners in critical minerals development. Many of the richest deposits are located in traditional territories, and successful projects require Indigenous consent and participation. The Ring of Fire project in northern Ontario, potentially one of the world's largest sources of chromite and nickel, is being developed in partnership with local First Nations communities. These partnerships ensure that resource development benefits local communities rather than just extracting wealth. From an environmental perspective, Canadian critical minerals processing is typically much cleaner than alternatives. Our electricity grid is predominantly renewable, meaning processing facilities can operate with lower carbon footprints than facilities powered by coal electricity in other countries. I want to pause here to ask your opinion on a critical policy question. Should Canada prioritize building domestic processing capabilities, even if it means higher short-term costs and longer project timelines? Or should we focus on maximizing raw material exports and leave processing to established international suppliers? This choice will shape our economic future for decades. Are we willing to invest in becoming a critical minerals superpower? Or should we stick to our traditional role as a raw materials exporter? What's your take? Share your thoughts in the comments below. While Canada's critical minerals potential is enormous, we face significant challenges that could prevent us from realizing this opportunity. First, there's the infrastructure gap. Many of our richest mineral deposits are located in remote northern regions with limited transportation, electricity, and communication infrastructure. Developing these deposits requires massive upfront investments in roads, power lines, and processing facilities. Second, we face competition from other countries that are also trying to challenge Chinese dominance. Australia has launched its own critical mineral strategy and is offering similar incentives to attract investment. Chile and Argentina are developing their lithium processing capabilities. Third, the regulatory approval process in Canada can be lengthy and complex. While our environmental standards are a competitive advantage in the long term, they can delay projects and increase costs compared to jurisdictions with looser regulations. Fourth, we have a skills shortage in mining engineering, metallurgy, and advanced processing technologies. Building a world-class critical minerals industry requires specialized expertise that takes years to develop. Perhaps most concerning is the risk that Chinese companies could use their current market dominance to undercut Canadian processing facilities. They could temporarily reduce prices to make Canadian operations unprofitable, then raise prices once competition is eliminated. Finally, there's the risk of technological disruption. New battery technologies might reduce demand for some critical minerals while increasing demand for others. Solid-state batteries, for example, might require different materials than current lithium-ion technologies. The battle for critical minerals supremacy is not just about economics. It's about which nations will have the power to shape the 21st century global economy. Countries that control critical minerals processing will be able to influence the pace and direction of the green energy transition. They'll determine which technologies succeed, which countries can access clean energy infrastructure, and how quickly the world can decarbonize. This gives critical minerals producers enormous diplomatic leverage, just as oil producers used energy exports to influence foreign policy. Critical minerals. Producers could use battery materials and clean energy components as tools of statecraft. For Canada, success in critical minerals could transform our international position. Instead of being a middle power dependent on resource exports, we could become an essential player in global supply chains for the most important technologies of the next century. But failure to develop our processing capabilities would leave us in the same subordinate position we've occupied for decades, supplying raw materials to other countries that add the real value and capture the strategic benefits. The window of opportunity won't stay open forever. China is working to secure supply chains through investments in African and South American mines. Other countries are building their own processing capabilities. If Canada doesn't move quickly to develop our critical minerals industry, we might find ourselves locked out of the supply chains we should be leading. If you're finding this analysis of Canada's critical minerals potential valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue examining the resource and technology trends that will shape our economic future. Also, if you work in mining, manufacturing, or clean energy, I'd love to hear your perspective on Canada's critical mineral strategy. The comments section often provides insights from industry professionals that add valuable context to these discussions. Friends, we are living through the most significant transformation of the global economy since the Industrial Revolution. The countries that control the supply chains for clean energy technologies will hold the keys to economic and political power for the next century. Canada has been dealt a winning hand in this transformation. We have the raw materials, the political stability, the clean energy, and the technical expertise to become a critical minerals superpower. The question is whether we have the vision and commitment to build the processing capabilities that would make this potential a reality. For too long, Canada has been content to export raw materials and import finished products. We shipped lumber and imported furniture. We exported crude oil and imported gasoline. We have been hewers of wood and drawers of water when we could have been builders of the future economy. The critical minerals revolution gives us a chance to break this pattern. We can build lithium processing facilities, nickel refineries, and battery manufacturing plants. We can capture the high-value parts of the supply chain instead of leaving them to other countries. But this transformation won't happen automatically. It requires sustained investment, supportive government policies, and a national commitment to building industrial capabilities rather than just extracting resources. The next decade will determine whether Canada becomes a critical mineral superpower or remains a supplier of raw materials to other countries' industries. The choice is ours, but we need to make it soon. China spent decades building its critical minerals dominance while the West focused on other priorities. Now we have a narrow window to challenge that dominance before it becomes unbreakable. Canada has the resources, the opportunity, and the capability to win the battery wars. The question is, do we have the will to seize this moment? Thank you for joining me for this exploration of Canada's critical minerals potential. What aspects of this opportunity do you think are most important for our economic future? Share your insights below, and I'll see you in the next analysis.